Imagine, if you will, being roused from a dream by a sound you can't quite place. You're adrift in a sea of tranquility, your mind painting pictures of joy and contentment. As you're about to reach for that elusive golden apple in your dream, a harsh noise pierces this serene tableau. It's a jarring note in your symphony of peace, a discordant rhythm that nudges you closer to the shores of wakefulness. The dream begins to slip, like sand through your fingers. You're caught in that twilight zone between sleep and wakefulness, where reality and fantasy intermingle. A fog of disorientation wraps around you, obscuring your senses. You're conscious, but not quite. Awake, but still ensnared in the tendrils of your dream. The sound persists, a rhythmic thud that echoes around you. It's an alien intrusion in the silence of the night, an unwelcome guest that refuses to leave. It's a sound that's hard to place, and yet it tugs at the corners of your memory. There's something familiar about it, something that sends a chill down your spine. You try to shake off the remnants of sleep, to clear the fog that clouds your mind. The sound becomes clearer, more defined. A cold dread seeps into your heart, replacing the warmth of your dream. It's a sound you've heard before, a sound you'd hoped never to hear again. Your heart beats in sync with it, a rapid tattoo of fear. It's a sound that's been etched into your memory, a sound that's become a part of you. It's a sound that's synonymous with finality, with an end. It's the sound of a hammer hitting a nail, of wood creaking under the strain. It's the sound of a coffin being sealed. As the fog of sleep lifted, the realization dawned. It was the unmistakable sound of hammering. Now fully awake, the peculiarities of my situation began to unravel. I was no longer in the safety of my own bed, wrapped in the warmth of my quilt. The darkness surrounding me was dense, impenetrable, and the air was stale and heavy. It didn't take long for my mind to start piecing together the jigsaw puzzle of horror. The first real clue was the hard surface beneath me. It was cold and unyielding, unlike any mattress. The space was tight, confining, with no room to stretch my arms or legs. I tried to sit up, but a solid barrier met my forehead. A wave of fear washed over me as I realized I was encased in something, trapped in a tight, narrow box. My heart pounded against my ribcage like a frightened bird, its rhythm echoing in the confined space. My breaths came in short, sharp gasps, each one more frantic than the last. The air was thin and suffocating. Each inhalation felt like an act of rebellion against my surroundings. I tried to move, to push against the walls of my prison, but my attempts were futile. Then it hit me. The realization so dreadful it felt as if ice-cold water had been poured down my spine. The muffled sound of dirt, the confined space, the stale air. My mind screamed in protest, refusing to accept the horrendous reality. But the truth was undeniable. I was in a coffin. A scream tore from my throat, raw and primal. It echoed back at me, a chilling reminder of my predicament. The walls of the coffin seemed to close in around me, feeding my claustrophobia. I clawed at the lid, my nails scraping against the hard surface, but it was unyielding, as unmovable as the weight of my despair. The dread was all-consuming as I realized the horrifying truth. I was buried alive. Then, as swiftly as it began, the hammering ceased. An eerie silence swept over me. The absence of that relentless pounding was almost more unnerving than the sound itself. The sudden stillness was a harbinger of the terrifying reality that was about to dawn on me. It was as though time had stopped. The world outside my wooden prison was hushed, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The silence wasn't an ordinary one. It was the kind that creeps under your skin, the kind that makes your heart race and your mind reel. It was the silence of forgotten graves, of secrets buried deep, the silence of the end. In the darkness, my senses heightened. The smell of the damp earth, the taste of fear in my mouth, the feel of the cold, hard coffin against my back, and above all, the silence. It was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat, a steady rhythm that was rapidly increasing in tempo. But then, a new sound broke the silence. A soft, muffled thud. It was barely audible, like a whisper in the wind. But I knew what it was. It was the sound of dirt falling onto the coffin. The realization sent shivers down my spine. I was not just alone. I was being left alone, forgotten, buried alive. The thuds became more frequent, each one a chilling reminder of my predicament. I was trapped, entombed in a wooden box with only the sound of the falling dirt to keep me company. It was a sound that would haunt my dreams, a sound that would become my reality. The darkness around me seemed to grow even darker, the silence even louder. I was alone in my coffin, alone with the sound of my impending doom. The world above continued on, oblivious to my plight. In the deafening silence, the soft thud of dirt hitting the coffin was a chilling reminder of my predicament. The sound of silence was now the soundtrack of my nightmare, a terrifying symphony that played on, unending. In my terror, I screamed, a primal, guttural sound that echoed in the tiny, confining space. My voice was raw, the desperate screams tearing from my throat like a wild beast clawing its way out of a trap. The fear was palpable, a tangible entity that wrapped itself around me, seeping into every pore, every crevice of my being. Each scream was a plea, a cry for help, for mercy, for an end to this waking nightmare. They were filled with a desperation that spoke of my dire circumstances, of the hopelessness that had taken root deep within me. It was a sound that no human should ever have to make, a sound that was born of the most profound terror one could ever experience. But with each passing moment, the screams became weaker, less distinct. They were slowly being replaced by a horrifying silence, a silence that was as deafening as the screams themselves. The physical exhaustion was setting in, my body betraying me in this moment of dire need. Each breath became a labor, each scream a monumental effort. But it wasn't just the physical exhaustion that was taking its toll. The emotional toll was far greater, far more devastating. The hopelessness of my situation was like a heavy weight pressing down on me, a weight that grew heavier with each passing moment. It was a despair that was all-consuming, a despair that threatened to drown me in its depths. I could feel my strength waning, my resolve crumbling. The screams were becoming less frequent, less desperate. They were slowly being replaced by a quiet acceptance, a grim resignation to my fate. It was as if I had screamed myself hoarse, screamed until there was nothing left to scream. And then there was silence. A silence that was as terrifying as the screams themselves. A silence that spoke of a despair so profound, so all-consuming, that it left no room for anything else. My screams echoed, a haunting symphony to my despair, till I had no more strength left to scream. In the end, the silence was absolute. A silence so profound it was deafening. It was in this silence that the stark reality of my predicament took hold. Buried beneath layers of cold, unfeeling earth, I was trapped in a world devoid of light, of sound, of life. The fear that had initially seized me was now a constant companion. It crept into every corner of my confined space, wrapping around me like a shroud. Fear of the dark, fear of the unknown, fear of the inevitable. But more than anything, it was the fear of being forgotten, of being left behind, that was the most terrifying. The world above carried on, oblivious to the horror that had befallen me. The panic, too, was unrelenting. It surged in waves, threatening to consume me. Each gasping breath was a battle, a desperate plea for survival. I was a prisoner of my own mind, my thoughts spiraling into an abyss of despair and hopelessness. And the helplessness was the cruelest of all. There was no escape, no respite from the oppressive darkness. I was at the mercy of a fate crueler than death itself, a fate I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy. The implications of such an experience are far-reaching. The mental trauma, the psychological scars, they are wounds that time may never heal. The struggle for survival, the fight for every breath, it leaves a mark on your soul, an indelible imprint of fear and despair. It's a reminder of our own mortality, a stark revelation of how fragile life truly is. As the last vestiges of hope faded, I was left with the chilling realization. The world had moved on, blissfully unaware of the nightmare unfolding 6 feet under. The earth above me, once a symbol of life and growth, was now a cold, unfeeling tomb, a stark reminder of the horrifying ordeal I had endured. Y'all, we're wrapping up here, but don't you go anywhere just yet. Show some love, hit that like button. Fancy more content like this? Go on, subscribe and let that bell icon ring so you won't miss a beat. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, sharing is caring. Until next time, stay tuned.